So welcome, honored guests and distinguished members of our university community and all who have made their way on this beautiful day to today's 27th Annual University of Michigan Senate's Davis Margaret Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. I'm Robert Ortega, faculty at the School of Social Work and chair of the Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs and Senate Assembly. It's our pleasure today to present events as part of our University of Michigan's bicentennial celebration and in collaboration with MC² Michigan and the Climate Crisis, which has a week-long series of events organized to explore the role of the university in the climate crisis. After today's lecture, you're invited to attend a political panel with Sandra Steingraber, climate activist and author, and Stephen Mulkey, President Emeritus of Unity College, from 7 to 8:30 at 1040 Dana Commons. Then there will be a reception before the event in Dana Commons. I'll direct your attention to the flyers that you received as you are entering and make an additional mention of Bill McKibben's keynote lecture at Hill Auditorium at 5 this coming Thursday. This lecture affirms the faculty's firm belief that academic and intellectual freedom are fundamental values for a university in a free society. We recognize that these values and rights are constantly vulnerable to fears and efforts to censor unpopular ideas, and that the protection of academic and intellectual freedom requires continuous reminders of their value and vulnerability. At this point, I would like to introduce Peggy Hollingsworth, president of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund since 1991. Peggy's leadership and contributions to faculty governance and service have been widely recognized. She's worked tirelessly to help organize and raise funds to support this lecture series, and it is my pleasure to welcome Peggy to the podium, and where she will introduce our honored guest, Chancellor Davis.
When, on behalf of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, I contacted Michael Mann to be the 2017 Davis Margaret Nickerson Lecturer, he agreed despite a very demanding schedule. Needless to say, we were delighted and look forward to his visit with us. His lecture today would undoubtedly add to the other scholarly jewels in the crown of the lecture series of the Davis Margaret Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. Professor Mary Crichton, then president of the University of Michigan chapter of the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, sent a letter on November 1st, 1989 to the Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs, SACUA, the executive committee of the faculty, to, quote, request that SACUA consider the AAUP proposal that the university make a significant gesture of reconciliation to the 3 suspended professors, end quote, for the egregious treatment to which they had been subjected. That year, it was already over 3 decades since the 1954 hearings of those 3 professors before a subgroup of the House Un-American Activities Committee and their initial suspensions from the university. Some of us on SACUA at the time, with the support and assistance of our colleagues in AAUP, initiated the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund and annual lectures to honor the bravery and integrity of Professors Davis, Margaret, and Nickerson. These outstanding lectures have continued annually now for nearly 30 years, emphasizing the critical importance of academic and intellectual freedom, especially in academic settings. It is through the dedication and nurturing of AFLF members and board of directors that all of us have been enriched by this series of presentations. One does have to wonder, however, why it took almost 36 years from those professors' initial suspensions by the university for this fitting response to come from the faculty. Unfortunately, 2 of our honorees, Clement Margaret and Mark Nickerson, are no longer with us. However, I am very pleased that our third honoree, Chandler Davis, is here with us, as he has been each year since Robert O'Neill's inaugural lecture in 1991, with the exception of last year when his wife, Natalie Zeman Davis, was recovering from surgery. A summary of his many accomplishments is in your program. Chandler has agreed to make a few comments. We look forward with great anticipation to the sonnet he promised when I contacted him to make a presentation this year. Thank you.
It's pleasant to find myself again in the chair opening a seminar at the University of Michigan. The last time I did, it was the Science Research Club. That was a group of 70 or so faculty scientists who met once a month to hear a lecture on science across the board, anything from astronomy to microbiology. I took on the task of organizing it that academic year, to general approval, if I do say so. Now here I am again. This time not for the Science Research Club, but for the Academic Freedom Lecture. There's been a lapse of 63 years. There's a delicious irony about this. In 1954, a committee of members of the Academic Senate, appointed by the Senate, under Professor Angus Campbell, unanimously advised the Board of Regents to expel me from the university, which the regents did. And then in the late 1980s, the same Academic Senate remarkably looked again at the history and called on the regents also to reevaluate it. A nearly unprecedented turnaround. The regents did not. That's when the Senate, as Peggy has recounted, that's when the Senate decided the university needed an annual public meeting on the problem of permitting nonconformity on campus and set up the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund to fill this need. Good, said Clem Markert. If the regents had simply apologized, that would have been the end of it. This way, the campus gets reminded every year. And so it has happened for 27 years now to general approval, with invited speakers like Catherine R. Stimpson, Roger Wilkins, Ellen Schrecker, David Cole, Noam Chomsky. You're in good company. I'm looking forward to Michael's lecture, but I don't want to begin without giving some appreciation for the extraordinary accomplishment. I can praise it unstintingly because it was not my doing. The program calls me an honoree, but my principal role is a rank and file supporter. The people who did it had to convince the Academic Senate to see that they should acknowledge a blemish on the university's record. And that took patient and able advocacy by Wilfred Kaplan, Mary Crichton, William Alexander, known as Buzz Alexander, David Hollinger, C.B. Smith, known as Tad Smith, and others. And then, second thing had to be done, the commitment to produce a substantial and challenging annual lecture had to be carried out. And that took devoted labors by the original gadflies, of course, and several recruits over the years. And the center of this amazing crew was Peggy Hollingsworth, the partner of Tad Smith in life, in research, and in service to academia. Tad, as many of you know, died last year, and this was a grievous loss not only to Peggy but to the world. Peggy has carried on nobly and the fund is strong as ever, thanks largely to her dedication and her good sense, diplomatic without being easily dissuadable, and wise in political and intellectual wisdom. I joked about writing a sonnet, and Peggy took me up on it, so I had to write a sonnet. This concerns one moment in the events of 1954. The list of victims of the Red Hunters had been pared down to only two, Mark Nickerson and myself. And Angus Campbell's committee was charged with advising the university what to do about us. We thought they ought to tell the university, this is interference with academic freedom. Tell them to go fly a kite. But the Campbell committee decided to play along in the hopes that they could reduce the number of victims from 2 to 1. So this is my reaction. The wolves of anti-rationality bay fearsomely around the courthouse door. Judge Angus Campbell is trying Nick and me, the sacrificial lambs they slaver for. But Angus, stay. Don't judge us by the rules imposed by free inquiry's enemies. To take their law book would be, to take the law book of these rabid fools betrays your court's traditional liberties. Angus, unmoved, decrees he will use the wolves' criteria so that they may be content with just a single victim. Whom to choose? Davis. He's young and more intransigent. So, the wolves axe me, as Angus asked them to, but not a whit appeased, take Nick's job too.
And now to introduce our keynote speaker is Dr. Mark Schlissel, the 14th president of the University of Michigan. In his remarks to graduates at our 2015 winter commencement, he reminded us of the values we place on academic, intellectual, and expressive freedoms in pursuit of knowledge and understanding. And despite the fact that many campuses succumb to the scaremongering and demagoguery of the McCarthy era, he drew attention to the important relationship between academic integrity and academic freedom. That was challenged then, and that we must continue to uphold without fear or compromise. Please help me welcome President Mark Schlissel.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Professor Ortega, for the introduction, and also thank you for serving as the chair of SACUA this year. So your service to the faculty and your service to the university are appreciated. I'd like to extend my own special welcome, although not in a poetic form, to Professor Chandler Davis, whose unfair treatment here over 60 years ago continues to inspire the University of Michigan community to always remember our highest academic values as we strive to uphold this university as a true marketplace of ideas. I also express my appreciation to the University of Michigan's Faculty Senate, to Dr. Hollingsworth and all the members of our community who've worked to preserve the values of academic and intellectual freedom, both here at the University of Michigan and beyond. This lecture and everything it stands for has been made so meaningful as a result of the work of many people in our community. I hope that the University of Michigan will always be an inalienable forum for discovery, debate, and discussion, a place where respect and disagreement are complementary, where each makes the other stronger, and where we all advocate for and learn from their confluence. The Davis, Markert, and Nickerson Academic Freedom Lecture raises the level of conversation and debate on our campus. It addresses essential aspects of free expression and thought and gives our community the opportunity to engage with some of the world's leading minds. It also helps us to remember and learn from the mistakes of the past, including those made by the university when it sought to silence the scholars who are the namesake of this lecture. At a place like the University of Michigan, it is essential that we never stop learning, thinking, and questioning ourselves, our society, and our role in the world. Today's lecturer is uniquely suited to discuss these ideas. Dr. Michael E. Mann is a scientist, author, and outspoken advocate for the role of science in influencing policy decisions. Through the intersection of these qualities, he is one of our nation's leading voices in the battle against climate change caused by human activity. Dr. Mann has received threats on his life, threats to his job, and threats to his family since publishing research that illustrated an upward trending temperature curve due to global warming. He's continued to speak out and to share his scientific research broadly, and to, in his words, ensure that the policy debate is informed by an honest assessment of the risks. Dr. Mann is a distinguished professor of atmospheric science at Penn State University and is director of Penn State's Earth System Science Center. He's written 3 books, is the author of more than 200 peer-reviewed and edited publications, and in 2015 was elected a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In a New York Times opinion piece in 2014, Dr. Mann wrote that it is no longer acceptable for scientists to remain on the sidelines. If scientists choose not to engage in a public debate, he continued, we leave a vacuum that will be filled by those whose agenda is one of short-term self-interest. There's a great cost to society if scientists fail to participate in the larger conversation. In fact, it would be an abrogation of our responsibility to society if we remained quiet in the face of such a grave threat. Friends and colleagues, please help me welcome the 2017 Davis, Markert, and Nickerson Academic Freedom Lecturer, Dr. Michael Mann.
Well, thanks so much, President Schlissel, and thanks to all of you who helped arrange this series. I do feel the weight of the legacy of this series, and it's an honor to indeed have one of the individuals whose namesake is honored. I am going to talk about the issue of human-caused climate change here on a brisk October 84-degree day in Ann Arbor. I spent a year in Ann Arbor. I went to kindergarten at the Stone School. My father was on sabbatical in the math department here at the University of Michigan, and I do remember some 84-degree days, but those were in the summer. They weren't in October. So the topic here, the Madhouse Effect. This is a book that I co-authored with Tom Tolles, who's the editorial cartoonist for the Washington Post, more than a year ago, actually last September. The title, Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy. Now, some people have argued that it was prescient for us to write a book on this topic with this title in September of last year. because, of course, a book about climate change based mostly on cartoons is one that might actually be read by our president. So I'm going to talk about climate change denial in the age of Trump, in this environment that we now find ourselves in, an environment of alternative facts and fake news. Those of us who have been on the front lines of the climate change debate were dealing with fake news and alternative facts before they were in fashion. And now, of course, this infection that afflicted our discourse over climate change has now taken hold in our entire body politic. So let's first try to get something straight here. When it comes to science, skepticism is a good thing, okay? People who doubt the evidence, who reject the overwhelming consensus of the world's scientists, they're not skeptics. These are contrarians or denialists, if they're literally denying the evidence. Now, the great Carl Sagan, who spoke eloquently on the topic of scientific skepticism and the importance of skepticism as part of the self-correcting machinery of science, I think put it best when he noted that the fact that some geniuses were laughed at does not imply that all who are laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Columbus, they laughed at the Wright brothers, they laughed at Fulton, but they also laughed at Bozo the Clown. And for every Fulton, for every Galileo, there are 1,000 Bozos the Clown. And now they happen to find themselves with a megaphone. Climate change denialism now has a voice as expressed in our highest political office in this country. Now, one of the pet peeves of those of us who participate in the larger discussion about climate change and its impacts and solutions is the phenomenon of false balance, where when climate change is a topic on a news show, they feel the need to have, alongside with a scientist, a climate change contrarian, when anywhere from 97 to 99% of scientists agree with the scientific consensus that climate change is real, it's human-caused, it's already a problem. But somehow there is this need in our media sort of environment to treat it as if it is a contested issue and to have a climate change contrarian alongside a climate scientist anytime the topic is discussed. When it comes to the theory of gravity, we don't have a physicist along with a president of the Flat Earth Society to debate them. And yet we do feel the need, or the media feels the need to do that when it comes to the topic of climate change. And it isn't just the conservative media, the fringe media. The New York Times this year introduced a columnist, Bret Stephens, who denies the reality and threat of climate change impacts. And so this has really infected our entire media, the notion that we have to treat climate change as if it's a debated proposition. When it comes to the scientific evidence, there's about as strong a consensus about climate change as there is about gravity. And yes, there's uncertainty when it comes to gravity. We still haven't observed a graviton. We haven't unified all of the forces of nature. So you could say there's still some uncertainty about gravity. But that doesn't make it safe to jump off a cliff. And yet there are those who would use the notion that there's still some uncertainty about some aspects of the science of climate change as reason to jump off the metaphorical cliff of refusing to act on this problem before it's too late. A pet peeve of mine is the way that the connection between climate change and extreme weather events is dealt with. And you'll often hear the assertion that climate change, when we have some superstorm, some unprecedented meteorological event, maybe that storm was one of mine and maybe it wasn't, you can't prove a thing. It's a loophole you could lose a planet through, as the small print says here. And indeed, that's the case. The question whether we can prove that climate change caused some particular storm is the wrong question. It's an irrelevant question. The relevant question is, are the impacts of these storms being made worse by climate change? Are they becoming more common? Whether it's Hurricane Harvey, the biggest flooding event on record, this devastation done by Irma, the strongest storm as measured by peak winds ever in the open Atlantic this season. Now, the last 2 years have been the warmest years globally, the warmest years when you look at global sea surface temperatures. We know that the energy for the intensification of hurricanes comes from the warmth of those waters, and there are some fairly fundamental theories based essentially on thermodynamics that predict that as those sea surface temperatures warm, we get more and more extreme, more and more intense hurricanes. So some would say it's a coincidence that in the last 2 years, when global surface temperatures have been the warmest on record, we've had the strongest storm ever measured in the world. That was Hurricane Patricia, over 200-mile-per-hour winds in the Pacific. That's also the strongest storm in the Pacific and in the Northern Hemisphere. We also had the strongest storm in the Southern Hemisphere, which was Winston, which struck Fiji, the strongest storm ever recorded in the Southern Hemisphere, the Northern Hemisphere, the Pacific, and now with Irma, the open Atlantic. Maybe it's a coincidence that all of that happened during the last 2 years when global sea surface temperatures were at an all-time high. I don't think it is a coincidence. And then, of course, it didn't stop with Irma. We saw the devastation, and we are still seeing, and we are still experiencing the devastation done by Maria, which essentially destroyed Puerto Rico. More warmth in the ocean, at the ocean surface, means stronger storms. Warmer ocean temperatures means more moisture in the atmosphere. More moisture in the atmosphere means more rainfall, especially for storms that stall, like Harvey did. Not a coincidence. Why should we care? Next chapter in the book. Well, polar bears and penguins are nice, and I'd like to have them around. I'd like my daughter to experience the wonder of nature that I experienced in my lifetime. I don't want these magnificent creatures like the polar bear to go extinct, but it's not just about polar bears and penguins. It's about devastating superstorms, unprecedented droughts and floods and heat waves. The impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We are seeing them play out in real time on our television screens, in our newspaper headlines. Well, there has been a denial, and there are vested interests who understandably would like to see us stay, in the words former President George W. Bush, stay addicted to fossil fuels, and they fought tooth and nail to ensure that be the case by attacking the science linking climate change to the burning of fossil fuels, by attempting to discredit the science, and often by trying to discredit the scientists themselves. And I have found myself in the crosshairs of those attacks. And denialism sort of works like this. The first stage of denial, because as we all know, there are stages of denial, and we have to work our way through the various stages of denial. The first stage of denial is it's not happening. How many of you have heard that there was a pause in global warming, that there was a hiatus in global warming? Anyone read headlines or claims like that in the media? Well, let's see, 2014 was the warmest year on record until 2015. which was the warmest year on record, until 2016, which was the warmest year on record. The numbers aren't yet in for 2017. Now, the next stage of denial is, okay, yeah, it's been really warm, but maybe that's natural. Stovetop temperatures change naturally. Maybe it's natural. Well, actually, we published an article earlier this year to actually look at that. We estimated, using a method that involves climate models and observational data, what was the likelihood of 3 consecutive record-breaking global temperatures, both with and without the effect of global warming. And we have a nice abstract here which refers to the coupled model intercomparison project, phase 5, a likelihood of less than 0.03% consecutive records, 0.7% in its absence. Well, I could read you the whole abstract, but I think that this article in Discover that talked about our findings probably did a better job of communicating or the basic essence of our finding. It's not natural. It's not natural. Snowstorm in Washington, D.C. doesn't disprove climate change, despite a senator from Oklahoma who might like you to think that. I have to tell a short story. Senator Inhofe, who has declared climate change to be the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people, coincidence, by the way, he is one of the largest recipients of fossil fuel money in the U.S. Senate, probably just a coincidence. Well, he was invited in 2011 to give the keynote speech at the annual Climate Change Denial Conference of the Heartland Institute. The Heartland Institute is a industry-funded think tank. It was supported by the tobacco industry to try to debunk the science linking their product to human health effects, and today is working to discredit the science of climate change. And in 2011, James Inhofe was invited to be their keynote speaker. He had accepted the invitation, but at the last minute he had to back out. He had gotten ill swimming in a lake back in his home state of Oklahoma. The lake was suffering an algal bloom as a result of the unprecedented heat and drought that Oklahoma was experiencing that summer. So James Inhofe was unable to give that speech. Well, the next line, next rung in this ladder of denial is, okay, well, maybe it's not entirely natural, but hey, it's self-correcting, right? Sea levels climb to the point where they snuff out the coal-fired power plants. It's self-correcting. Well, unless you mean by self-correcting that we literally unbury all of the carbon that was buried over 100 million years since the early Cretaceous by natural processes, what we're doing is we're taking all that carbon that was around when the dinosaurs were roaming the planet, and it got buried over 100 million years under the ground. We are digging it up and putting it back into the atmosphere, but not over a time frame of 100 million years. We're doing it over a time frame of 100 years, 1 million times faster. And there's no reason to believe that we or other living things can adapt to such unprecedented rates of change in our environment. So no, in no meaningful way is it self-correcting. Oh, maybe it's a good thing. All right, it's not self-correcting, it'll be good for us. It's a little bit of warming. Melting ice sheets lift all boats, after all. Well, unless you mean that devastating flooding of Houston, and they're still dealing with the health effects of that flooding. People are dying from diseases, waterborne illnesses, the devastation that we're seeing unfold in real time that's continuing to unfold in Puerto Rico. I don't think that's a good thing. And if you look objectively at the impacts of climate change on food, on water, on human health, on our economy, on national security across the board, climate change is already doing great damage, and if we continue on this road, we will see truly catastrophic and irreversible impacts of climate change. Not a good thing. Not a good thing. Unprecedented drought in California, not a good thing. Unprecedented drought in Syria, worst drought in 900 years that forced rural farmers into the cities where they were competing for food and water and space with the people in those cities, creating an atmosphere of unrest in which organizations like ISIS can flourish. Probably not a good thing. Probably not a good thing. The West is burning. As we continue to be preoccupied in the eastern U.S. by these unprecedented storms that have wrought unprecedented destruction, meanwhile, the western U.S. is experiencing unprecedented heat, unprecedented wildfire. There was an article in the Washington Post, an op-ed in the Washington Post, "The American West is Burning." It was by Steve Daines, a Republican senator representing Montana. It failed to mention climate change or global warming. You can't solve a problem. You can't solve a problem if you don't recognize the cause. Other articles have been a little more blunt about the cause. Why is the West burning? This article in Outside magazine, extreme heat. The drought persists despite a wet winter. It's not rocket science. Extreme heat, extreme drought, extreme wildfire, unprecedented wildfire. And again, threat multiplier. More competition, growing global population for food and water and land as our coastlines are flooded, as the tropics become unlivable, too hot. That's a prescription for conflict and for a national security nightmare. So even if you don't care about any of the other impacts of climate change, if you care about national security, you should care about climate change. Well, and then the final sort of rung in the ladder of denial. Okay, well, you know what? We just spent all this time debating the problem, and it's too late. It's too late to do anything. The good news is it isn't too late. And I think there'll be a number of talks here over the next several days by people at the forefront of the climate movement who are paving the way to action. And there is still a path forward. It isn't too late. So there has been, as I mentioned before, this effort, the denialism of climate change didn't just emerge organically. It has been carefully cultivated by fossil fuel interests who have spent tens of millions of dollars in a massive disinformation campaign intended to confuse the public and confuse policymakers about the science. And it's often involved attacks on climate scientists. The war on climate science will probably continue on, just like the last Japanese soldier still fighting World War II. As long as there are fossil fuels to be burned, we will still encounter climate change denialism, but it will become irrelevant. We will have moved on. Now, when it comes to climate change denialism, as we've already seen with the anecdote about James Inhofe, there is some amount of irony, one might say hypocrisy, when it comes to the denial of climate change. As folks have alluded to, I have experienced some of that myself. I've been at the receiving end of congressional inquiries and threatened subpoenas. And then there was Ken Cuccinelli. To me, he's the Cooch. If you know him well, he's the Cooch. Ken Cuccinelli, the former Attorney General of Virginia, who attempted to subpoena all of my personal emails from the time that I was a faculty member at the University of Virginia, presumably in an effort to try to find something in my personal emails to embarrass me, to discredit the iconic hockey stick graph that I had published. Had become this sort of icon in the climate change debate. Well, Ken Cuccinelli's congressional subpoena was rejected by the lower court. Well, let me say, first of all, that the Washington Post weighed in on the matter not once or twice or 3 times or 4 times, but at least 5 times. At least 5 times the Washington Post sort of weighed in, denouncing Ken Cuccinelli's witch hunt against me and the University of Virginia, what they saw as an obvious effort to intimidate an academic whose findings might be inconvenient to the special interests that fund Mr. Cuccinelli. Tom Tolles, award-winning cartoonist of the Washington Post, weighed in on the matter not once, but twice. And I have to confess, this is my favorite here. Poor Galileo down here, and Cuccinelli wants his emails too. I don't mind being compared to Galileo, I guess. Well, the Cooch His subpoena was quashed by the lower court on a mere technicality. In his 40-page filing to the court, he had failed to provide evidence of wrongdoing on my part. And so the case was thrown out. Of course, he appealed to the state Supreme Court, which a couple years later ruled against Cuccinelli with prejudice, meaning, well, you guys, this is a law school, you know. They really would like to not see him ever come back to the court with something like that again. So that was a battle that was won. Now, Cuccinelli wasn't done. He ran for governor of Virginia in the next election, and I dutifully campaigned for his opponent, Terry McAuliffe. There's me, Terry, and Bill. I got to introduce Bill Clinton, who introduced Terry McAuliffe in the final rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and McAuliffe was victorious. And in fact, his folks say that if you looked at the internal numbers, Ken Cuccinelli's assault on the University of Virginia and me probably bought them several percent in the final tally. Even conservatives, conservative Virginians didn't like the idea of an attorney general attacking Thomas Jefferson's University and professors at Thomas Jefferson's University. Terry won by less than 1%, by the way. Ken Cuccinelli, and look this up yourself, Google it. You can't make this stuff up, I promise. He went on to work on an oyster farm on Tangier Island. This is an island in the Chesapeake Bay that is slowly succumbing to the effects of global sea level rise. Hypocrisy, climate change denial is thy name. Well, what about the solutions? We're getting close to the end here. We could listen to folks like CEO, ExxonMobil CEO, Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who sees geoengineering. Geoengineering will just massively interfere with this system that we don't understand perfectly in the hope that maybe we'll offset global warming. We'll shoot stuff into the stratosphere or dump things into the ocean, maybe put mirrors in space. And some of the adherents to geoengineering are our current Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who sees climate change as just an engineering problem. It's just a problem we can engineer our way out of. And this is sort of popular. This is what I sometimes refer to as the kinder, gentler form of denialism that we now encounter, which isn't outright rejection of the science, but it is the argument that we don't need to do anything about it. The impacts aren't that bad, and if we want to do something about the impacts, we'll just engage in some techno fix. And what's so remarkable about those who advocate this, like the Breakthrough Institute, there's a group called the Breakthrough Institute, and who wouldn't be for a breakthrough? Except the Breakthrough Institute doesn't seem interested in any genuine breakthroughs at all. In fact, if you ask them, what if, the Breakthrough Institute also supports geoengineering. Again, will interfere in some massive way at a global scale in an unprecedented manner, using the stuff of science fiction to try to cover up the effect of global warming. And then when you ask folks like the Breakthrough Institute, you say, well, what if we were, just a thought, what if we were to take existing renewable energy technology and we were to scale it up to meet our growing energy needs? It's like, no way could you do that. There's just no way you could possibly do that. There seems to be some asymmetry in their skepticism, if you want to call it that, when it comes to solutions. So the real solution, of course, the real path forward is to solve the problem at its source, is to do something about the ongoing accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. We've seen some real progress here in recent years. The Paris Accord, nearly 200 nations from around the world agreeing to make substantial cuts in carbon emissions. And if you tally up the net effect of those commitments, it's enough to get us halfway from where we would be heading towards truly catastrophic climate change, to 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, 7 to 9 degree Fahrenheit warming of the planet by the end of the century. gets us halfway to where scientists say we need to be at 2 degrees Celsius or below. 2 degrees Celsius or below. We've already warmed a little more than a degree. We don't have much left, but we can still stabilize warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Paris Accord gets us halfway there. Doesn't solve the problem, and some of the critics will say, well, the Paris Accord doesn't solve the problem. Well, Rome wasn't built in a day, right? It puts in place a framework that we can build upon, and we can ratchet up those commitments at the next conference of the parties. We can now see a path forward. We can see a path forward to stabilizing warming below dangerous levels. And of course, we've had the moral leadership of Pope Francis and the Vatican weigh in to sort of recenter the debate where it should be centered, because this isn't just a matter of science or politics or economics. It's a matter of ethics. It's a matter of intergenerational ethics. Do we want to leave behind a degraded planet for future generations? And I think we need to firmly recenter the debate as a debate over ethics, intergenerational ethics, and ethical obligations to others on the planet today. And the Pope has helped do that. So we've seen some real progress, but we've encountered an obstacle or two as well. When the galleys came back last September, a year ago, or actually late August, we're looking through the book, and it's like, Tom, we don't have a Trump cartoon in this book. And it was starting to appear that maybe Donald Trump might be relevant to what happens. So at the last minute, Tom drew up a cartoon, and it's, of course, about a wall, Donald Trump building a wall that we will all pay for, the wall between him and the evidence for climate change. And we have encountered this setback, Trump threatening to back out of the Paris Accord, threatening to eliminate the Clean Power Plan that put us on the right path with our power-related carbon emissions, and to roll back automobile efficiency standards. Scott Pruitt, the EPA administrator under Trump, is literally undoing 50 years of environmental progress. Progress made, I would remind folks, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, unprecedented. And so we are confronted with this challenge. Now, it turns out that we can still meet our obligations under Paris, whether or not Trump claims to pull out of Paris or not. There's enough progress being made at the municipal level, at the state level, that there's a good chance we'll get there regardless of what actions the executive branch takes. But it's going to be difficult to make forward progress in an environment where polluters and deniers run the executive branch, which is where we are today. For one thing, yes, and there's Scott Pruitt, who is a darling of the Koch brothers and is literally dismantling all the environmental protections of the last half century. Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, now our Secretary of State. And this guy who would eliminate the Department of Energy if he could remember it, which he now runs. So we have to make sure our voices are heard. I've been doing the best that I can to make my voice heard. Spoke at the rally in Washington, D.C., marched in Washington, D.C., and everybody was asking, who's that guy with Mike Mann at the front of the line? Bill Nye, my good friend Bill Nye, has been out there. Bill Nye, the science guy, doing everything he can to focus attention on this problem. And it takes all of us making our voices heard. We've seen that matters. Despite the challenges we have in our politics today, the voice of the people still matters. We saw that in the healthcare debate. And so it is more essential than ever that we make our voices heard in every way possible. Governor McAuliffe, who I campaigned with when he ran for governor of Virginia, was one of the first governors when Trump said he was pulling out of Paris, Terry said, Virginia is staying in. We are committed to our obligations under the Paris Accord. Terry once said to me that elections matter. And here's an example. Elections do matter. We've got a really important midterm election coming up in a year or so. Things can change quickly. Political winds can change quickly. So let me just remind you that the earth quite literally does lie in the balance. So the decisions that we make and the actions we take in the years ahead are going to determine what sort of planet we leave behind for our children and grandchildren. There's still time to make sure that we leave behind the sort of planet that we would like to. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to field questions. Yes, Steve.
Mike, there's a group at Harvard that is working in a high-profile project on geoengineering. I wonder if you could comment on their plan.
I can restate the question. Yeah.
Mike, there's a group at Harvard that's working on geoengineering. They've been rather high-profile in advertising their intentions. And I wonder if you could comment on the research they're doing and the way they're going about it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So it's an interesting sort of quandary. Geoengineering, even if we believe it's a bad thing, and I believe in the law of unintended consequences. I'm one of those people who grew up, listening to the song about there was an old lady who swallowed a fly. And what killed her wasn't the fly, it was the horse, of course. It was the bad solution to the problem, to the initial problem. And one might argue that many of these geoengineering solutions suffer from the same malady. But an argument can be made, and is made passionately by some of my colleagues who I respect greatly, that we should study them so that we can explore some of those potential unintended consequences. And some of the research into geoengineering has indeed revealed some of the disturbing potential consequences, particularly with the scheme where we, volcanoes cool the planet for a few years because of all these particles called aerosols that form because of the stuff that gets up into the stratosphere, forms this blanket that blocks out some of the sun. And so one of the geoengineering schemes is to mimic what a volcano does, but to do it every few years, do the equivalent of a Mount Pinatubo-like eruption every other year, to constantly force Earth's climate system, putting these particles, so literally taking guns and shooting particles into the stratosphere where they remain for several years. And if we do this often enough and you do the calculation, well, we could offset the warming effect of greenhouse gases. But let's think of what's happening. While we're doing this, CO2 is still building up in the atmosphere. It's still acidifying the oceans. And at the rate we're going, the Great Barrier Reef doesn't have another decade. Ocean acidification is destroying our ocean biota, is destroying our coral reefs. So that problem persists. And anybody who's studied the climate system, and there are a number of experts in this room, the pattern of global warming doesn't look like the opposite of the pattern of volcanic cooling. So when you put them on top of each other, they don't cancel out. And the global average, maybe they'll cancel out. But some regions could actually warm even faster, while some regions cool. And most likely you slow down the global hydrological cycle. What does that mean in normal language? We dry out the continents even more. And that's just one of the schemes. And in just about all of these schemes, you run into the law of unintended consequences. As I've remarked in the past, there is only one truly safe potential geoengineering scheme. One form of technology that we could use to reverse climate change. A time machine. But we don't have one, and we're not likely to have one in the near future. So an argument can be made that studying the impacts, using models to study the potential impacts of geoengineering, can usefully inform the debate over whether we should implement it. And there's been some really good research, and my colleague Alan Roebuck at Rutgers wrote a great article. I think it's still up on the website of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which is something like 20 reasons why not to do geoengineering, and it's based on the scientific work that he's done exploring potential consequences. So thank you. Thanks, Steve.
This is a very interesting week because today the president is going to visit Puerto Rico and tomorrow he's going to visit Las Vegas. So the question is, what are the odds that in the course of either of those visits he will address the underlying causes of each of them?
Well, thanks for the question. Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'll give my estimate 0. Now let me provide a more nuanced response. It's never the right time to talk. We have a cartoon in the book and we have a discussion of the parallels between Superstorm Sandy and Sandy Hook, because these were both great tragedies. In one case, it was a tragedy worsened by climate change. In the other case, it was a tragedy almost certainly brought upon by the lack of sensible gun laws in this country. And what did the gun lobby and the fossil fuel lobby say at the time? This is not the right time to talk about this problem. Anytime there's an opportunity for sort of a teachable moment in the climate change debate or in the debate over gun policy, the vested interests who want to preserve the status quo will do everything they can to poison the waters. And we saw that in the wake of these latest hurricanes. We saw Scott Pruitt going out of his way to criticize scientists like me and some of my colleagues, saying we shouldn't be talking about how climate change might have worsened the impacts of this storm. That's politicizing a strategy. We've seen the same thing over the last few days with respect to this latest shooting. If ever there were crocodile tears, these are them. And what it is, it's an estimate, it's an attempt to try to discourage free and open conversation and consideration of why it is, what are the contributing factors that are leading to these disasters. So I think it's difficult not to recognize the parallels here, and it's the same talking point that's always trotted out. This is not the right time to talk about, well, what about a week from now? No, that wouldn't be the right time to talk about it. How about next year? That's certainly not the right time to talk about it. Thank you.
Yes, you mentioned Scott Pruitt. Technically, he's my boss, or my boss's boss's
Sorry.
boss's boss. Yeah. I work at the EPA lab here in town. That's where we wrote the standards, the tailpipe standards for cars and heavy-duty trucks. 2 questions. One is, there's talk about what sort of level, target we should have for carbon dioxide and maybe some of the other gases in order to stabilize the planet. Of course, there's 350.org. If you could comment on that, and also comment about the book Project Drawdown, that Paul Hawkins' book, and what you think about that and sort of the hierarchy of most important interventions down to the least.
Thanks for the question. Well, without going into the specifics of his book, I would say more generally there is sort of this hierarchy. We sometimes talk about sort of no regrets. There are all sorts of things that we can do in our everyday lives that make us healthier, they save us money, they make us feel better, and they cut our carbon emissions. Bicycling to school. I still remember here in Ann Arbor, during that sabbatical, my father would bicycle to the math department, and there was a child seat that I sometimes got a ride on. So bicycling to work, and buying more fuel-efficient vehicles, electric hybrid vehicles, recycling, more energy-efficient appliances. These are all things that we ought to be doing anyways, and they cut our carbon emissions, but it only gets us so far. So there's this sort of low-hanging fruit, and there's the stuff we ought to be doing, but to sort of get the sorts of reductions that will be necessary, if we are to not burn through our carbon budget, the budget we have left, before we commit to dangerous, more than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 degree Fahrenheit warming. That's going to require major market incentives. We're going to need a price signal in the market. And Bill McKibben, who you mentioned, 350.org, has been, I'm sorry I'll have to miss his presentation here. And I would encourage everybody to come out to listen to Bill, because he's been a leader, both in terms of raising awareness about the immediacy, the threat of climate change, and the fact that we can't burn through a budget, that we've got 5 times as much carbon in proven reserves of the fossil fuel companies as is necessary to give us dangerous 2 degrees Celsius warming. But he's also tried to levy pressure against institutions, including universities, to divest themselves of fossil fuel holdings. And there's a practical argument there, which is that if we decide, as we really need to act on this problem, then these companies are going to have major stranded assets. They're going to have to leave most of their assets in the ground. That makes them a bad long-term investment. So from an investment strategy, if it's a retirement fund, you ought not to be investing in them. But there's a symbolic point there as well. I would say this, that in terms of what's the safe level, Bill McKibben, based on the work of James Hansen, argues that 350 parts per million is the safe level. And then you say, well, aren't we over 400 right now? Yes, we're over 400. So that means we have to take carbon back out of the atmosphere. That's a hard thing to do. And a case could be made, that, hey, human civilization was built on a climate that corresponds with CO2 levels of 350 or lower, and that's really where we want to be. But in the near term, we are, in a matter of a decade or so, going to burn through the budget we have left for even keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius if we don't act. So first things first, we've got to bring those emissions down rapidly. I sometimes I point out that if we had acted on this problem 3 decades ago, my daughter's a much better skier than me. My 11-year-old daughter, she can go down the black double diamond slopes. I'm still on the bunny slopes, okay? And if we had acted 3 decades ago when we knew there was a problem, the emissions curve that we have to bring down, we'd be going down a bunny slope. It's pretty easy to do. I can do that. What 3 decades or more of inaction has bought us is a trip down the black double diamond slope. That's how quickly we have to bring carbon emissions down. And so, yeah, there's the low-hanging fruit, but that's not going to be enough. We're going to need major policy intervention here. And we're going to need politicians who are going to reflect our interests rather than the fossil fuel interests that may be funding them, which means turning up at the voting booth and making your voice heard in that way. Thank you.
Coincidentally or not, the distinguished economist Angus Deaton is speaking at the university this week. And his specialty is not climate change, but inequality, which is a reflection of some of the limitations of capitalism.
Wait, who is this?
Angus Deaton,
okay.
the Nobel laureate in economics.
Yeah.
And it's about a limitation of capitalism. Do you think that capitalism is inherently destructive of the environment? And if you listen to people from the Heartland Institute, that's what they're really afraid of. They talk about capitalism all the time. And even people on the left, Naomi Klein, to pick a name, is also specifically talking about that.
Yeah.
Can we address this without addressing perhaps even a bigger issue?
Well, thanks for the question. It's funny, my friend Jonathan Overpeck, who's the new dean of your College of the Environment, School of the Environment, I forget the exact name of the, we were discussing this yesterday. There was a study that came out that actually looked at 2 different proponents for action, looked at Bill McKibben versus Naomi Klein. Bill McKibben is articulating the case of acting within the market framework that exists. So working within the system that exists and solving the problem within that system by levying pressure on investors, the divestment movement, by bringing to light the problem of stranded assets, but working within the system that exists. Whereas Naomi Klein, as you allude to, is her thesis is that capitalism intrinsically cannot solve a problem like climate change. I tend not to side with her. I side more with Bill McKibben. I do think that we can solve this problem within the framework of a market economy. We've solved global environmental problems within the framework of market economies before, whether it was ozone depletion or acid rain, and some of that success came under Republican administrations here in the United States. And we did that through market mechanisms. George H.W. Bush introduced cap and trade as a way, as a market mechanism for dealing with acid rain. So my view is that the problem is we don't have a level playing field. The market can solve a problem, but not when it's treated as an externality, not when there's no market signal to reflect the damage that's being done by some particular set of actions. The fact is that we are doing damage to the planet when we burn carbon, damage that we're not doing when we use renewable forms of energy. So we need an incentive structure, which is the opposite of what we have. Right now, we're actually giving subsidies and incentives, more of them, to the fossil fuel industry, which is the reverse of what we need to do. We need to de-incentivize those energy forms of energy generation that are damaging the planet. And so, my view is that this problem, like other environmental problems that were solved through market mechanisms, this one's bigger, and it gets right at the heart of what drives our modern economies today, energy, which is currently mostly fossil fuel driven. But I don't see any reason why market mechanisms cannot be used to solve this problem. So I guess it's a very long-winded way of saying that I side more with Bill and less with Naomi, both of whom I respect tremendously.
So first of all, I wanted to say that we brought our 1-credit mini course on sustainability here, so thank you everybody for visiting our classroom today. Second of all, I would like to say that I'm going to make a somewhat bold assertion, but I think that it's justified in saying that everybody that's in this lecture room today has the responsibility of trying to disseminate the information that's being learned here. And if people take that responsibility seriously, it just magnifies the impact of a lecture like this, because we're all obviously, we care about this and we're moved by this. And then my question for you, related to the phenomenon of people wanting to balance, the climate deniers with the climate scientists. It seems that we are so obsessed with being respectful and with having logical integrity and with all of these things, and those are important, like we need to support respectful discourse and we have to do things that are the right thing. But I also worry that we end up limiting ourselves from being as effective as we can be, and that alludes to what you're saying about scientists staying out of the political realm for the fear of politicizing their science. But if they do that, then we let the conversation be run by people who do not know the science. And I don't claim to know the answer, and I don't think anybody really does, but I'm curious about what you think about that and how you personally draw the line between using, your own senses to do what you think is right or fighting fire with fire.
Well, thanks very much for the for the question and for your suggestion. I did write this op-ed, the title of which was "If You See Something, Say Something," the New York Times op-ed, and of course it's riffing off of the motto of our Department of Homeland Security, but it applies to us as scientists who are witnessing a major threat to our planet, and it would be an abrogation, as I had said in the piece, of responsibility not to try to make sure that we inform the discussion about what to do about this existential threat. Now, I used to be of the mind that scientists should stay completely outside of the political realm. And in fact, in my book, I even point out there was a quote, something I said at a Senate hearing back in 2003 when I was asked, actually by James Inhofe in that hearing, some question about policy, about energy policy. And I said, well, I don't see my role as, to speak about anything in the policy realm. I have since changed my view quite a bit, in part because of the experiences that I have gone through, and what I like to think of the growth that I've undergone, where I've come to, again, appreciate the fact that, we all have the right to our opinions and to express our opinions. And I like to think that when it comes to matters of policy, implications of climate change, that the fact that we actually study this problem, that it's our job to study this problem, does inform our opinions in a way that's useful. Our opinions about policy are informed by our understanding of what the science has to say, and I think that it's appropriate for us to not try to prescribe the policy solutions. I'm not out there, for example, saying that we should institute a revenue-neutral carbon tax or cap and trade. What I am out there saying is that we should put a price on carbon, okay? As a generic proposition, we need to somehow deal with the externality of the environmental damage that's done by the emission of carbon. And I'm happy to leave it to our policymakers, to our politicians, to debate in good faith how we go about solving that problem. And I think it's wonderful that you have conservatives like my friend Bob Inglis, former congressman from South Carolina, dyed-in-the-wool Republican, conservative, had a nearly perfect lifetime conservative voting record, but became convinced that climate change was a real problem and started speaking out about it. And as a result, found himself facing a primary challenge by another Republican who was well funded by a couple brothers from Kansas, whose name shall go unsaid, and he lost that election. The person who replaced him, a politician you may have heard of, Trey Gowdy. But Bob is now traveling around the country lecturing to conservative audiences that would probably throw rotten tomatoes at me if I entered into the auditorium, but they're happy to listen to Bob Inglis, who they perceive as sort of part of their tribal group. They're happy to listen to Bob talk about conservative proposals for pricing carbon, revenue-neutral carbon tax. That's the debate we should be having. That's the conversation that we should be having among our politicians, not is climate change real? I was debating that very proposition in the U.S. House of Representatives last March, where I was invited to testify against 3 climate change contrarians. So it was 3 contrarians against 1 mainstream scientist, which is a good approximation, right, to the 97 to 99% of the scientists versus the 1%. But as I've remarked, it wouldn't matter if they had had 100 or 200 witnesses on their side, because science isn't on their side. We've got to get away from the fake political debate about whether there's a problem. There's a worthy debate to be had about how we solve the problem. I resist the temptation to try to be prescriptive in dictating what policy prescriptions should be implemented to solve this problem. I would like to leave that to our policymakers, but it has to be informed, as I said in that op-ed, by an objective assessment of what the risks actually are. That has to be the starting point, and scientists, in my view, play a very important role as sort of the referees of that debate. Sure.
So I just want to honor that we had a time here at 5:15 that we would be ending this. But Dr. Mann will be available afterward if you want to take maybe 1 or 2 more.
Sure, 1 or 2.
And then
sure.
we'll go ahead and end, and then maybe you could meet in the lobby or something.
Well, or we'll field questions for as long as you want to do it here. Maybe that's the best way to, yeah.
All
Okay.
right. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So,
Do we have another one?
yeah, question here.
Yes, I'm a longtime Ann Arborite and community activist. And could you give some direction really to students who are engaged with these questions and faculty, how to get out of the gown bubble into the Ann Arbor community and the Washtenaw County? We try and have a meeting to get activists together but there does seem to be not exactly an abyss, but not an easy bridge of communication between the gown and the town. And on a question like this, it really involves the local government and all the levels of self-government. This resource of the university is underutilized. And in terms of that, the various campaigns toward divestment, toward moving your money and so on, how can both students and community have a more beneficial, more effective influence on the university that it should itself be a divest from its fossil fuels and provide some moral leadership on that score for all of Michigan?
Well, thanks for the question. And again, Bill McKibben, who's been leading the way on this, will be here, and it'd be a great question to put to him as well. I do personally see the role of the divestment movement. If nothing else, I think it has been powerful symbolically. The fact that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund divested themselves. This is the legacy of the fossil fuel industry. The Rockefeller Brothers, and they've divested themselves of fossil fuel holdings. The Gates Foundation has divested themselves of fossil fuel holdings. I actually spoke at the annual shareholders meeting of Berkshire Hathaway in Nebraska last spring. I was under misapprehension. I thought I was going to meet Jimmy Buffett. It turns out it was Warren Buffett. But one of the things that we had a few minutes to speak directly to Warren Buffett, and who accepts the science of climate change. He knows it's a problem. He just hasn't been convinced that he should be willing to allow climate change to influence his investment portfolio. And we pointed out that the chair of his board, Bill Gates, has divested. Maybe he needs to listen to his close friend, Bill Gates. I think that sends a powerful message. And so even if one might debate the actual economic impact that divestment has, it has a very powerful symbolic impact. I was at UC Berkeley during the 1980s when the anti-apartheid movement began as a college movement, and it had a real impact. These movements have an impact. It starts with colleges. It starts with the grassroots. I didn't finish the point I had made earlier. Bill McKibben, the study found that his efforts have been very effective, far more effective than Naomi Klein. And so the sort of social movement that he's created is moving the dial on this. So keep up the pressure is what I would say. Absolutely, and sometimes it's sort of preaching to the choir. Academic towns, university towns tend to be progressive hubs, and so it's one thing to get something passed in the town of Amherst where I grew up, or the city of Berkeley, or the town of Ann Arbor. It's something else to get them passed but you see mayors of some of the largest cities in the country, like Houston, like New York, like Los Angeles, who have taken a very proactive approach on climate. So thank you.
Yes, my question has to do with the fact that there are some well-credentialed climate scientists, such as Judith Curry, who is the former chair of the Atmospheric Science Department at Georgia Tech, who don't see the evidence as nearly as clear or as dire as you present. I think she resigned recently and wrote about what she felt was a kind of oppressive conformity that led her to leave academia. I wonder if you have some comments on that.
Yeah, thanks. So you do have contrarians in the climate change arena, and you have some prominent scientists who have sort of made a career out of being contrarians. Judith Curry, interestingly enough, was sort of at the leading edge of what you might even call climate change alarmism. Back in the mid-2000s, she was a co-author of an article arguing for a very substantial increase in Category 5 hurricanes, and testified I believe, in Congress about the dangerous impact that climate change is having on hurricanes, and was playing a very prominent role in that discussion. And that sort of degraded into a debate, and she was heavily criticized for accusing a fairly senior scientist in our field. She was quoted in the Wall Street Journal as referring to this scientist as brain fossilized, and got pretty personal. And I think that experience, well, I think that impacted her in a way that maybe has led to some loss of objectivity in the way she views the science and the role that she sees herself as playing. I have to be perfectly honest. I've seldom been able to make sense of her arguments. She likes to play up, and she was one of those three contrarian witnesses at that House Science Committee hearing that I testified at. She spoke about uncertainty and the importance of uncertainty. At one point, one of the Republican congressmen asked, did anyone want to weigh in on the issue of uncertainty? And none of the other witnesses actually wanted to say anything. So I said, well, I didn't think that the Republican was going to give me the floor, but I'm happy to take it. And I talked about something that Judith Curry seemed unwilling to talk about, which is the fact that uncertainty, if you talk to economists who actually study how scientific uncertainty translates to climate risk, uncertainty ends up being a reason for even more concerted action, because uncertainty cuts both ways. And it turns out the cost of having underestimated the impacts of climate change and under-mitigated is far greater than the cost on the other side. And so where you run into truly catastrophic outcomes are where it turns out that the actual climate changes are at the upper end of the uncertainty range, and the costs end up being far larger than we had projected, and the cost of action ends up being even smaller in comparison with the cost of inaction. And if anything, the science bears that out. Just within the last year or so, we have seen that the glaciological community has basically uncovered processes that were ignored in the climate. So here's an uncertainty. Here's something that wasn't in the models. So you say, the models, they're not very good. Yeah, the models weren't very good about this. They had left out a critical process that has to do with the way that ice cliffs collapse when you warm the ice shelves, and because of the sloping geometry of the Antarctic continent, because of the weight of the ice sheet, it slopes down, and so when you erode an ice cliff, the ice cliff behind it is even taller, and the one behind it is even taller. That wasn't included in the models. When you include that, it turns out that West Antarctic ice sheet can collapse, we now find, potentially far more rapidly than we thought, to the point where we now have to double our projected sea level rise relative to what the IPCC said just a few years ago. The IPCC said an upper end of about 1 meter, 3 feet or so of sea level rise. Now the best available science says we can't rule out 6 feet of sea level rise because, yes, there are uncertainties, and as we work through them and as we learn more, we're finding that in many respects, the problem is potentially worse. So uncertainty just doesn't play out the way contrarians like Judith Curry would like us and would like politicians to think it does. But thank you for the question. Wait, one more, sure. Yeah, why not?
Yes, I am not a human overpopulation denier. Now, if you say, I agree certainly that if you can't solve a problem if you don't recognize the causes. And the causes of global warming are basically that we have too many people on this planet consuming too many resources and land. And if we don't believe that, I think you need to ask, each of you here in this room needs to ask, how are we going to raise the living standards and the consumption of land for everyone, all 7.5 billion people in the world, to average current American living standards? And let alone the fact that in 2100, we're going to have 10 or 11 billion people. I think it just doesn't work, whatever you're planning, and I don't understand why the left continually ignores human overpopulation?
Huh. Well, it's sort of interesting because a good friend of mine, Paul Ehrlich, was heavily criticized for bringing the problem of human population to the forefront of the discussion back in the 1960s with his book, The Population Bomb. So he's often vilified by the right. So it's sort of, you know.
I'm not of the right. I'm an independent.
Well, sorry, but you were talking about the left, you know,
Yes,
the left.
the left,
Yeah.
the left
Yeah.
is for mass immigration. They want to build the U.S. population to 600 to 800
So let me
people
answer.
by
Yeah.
2100 through
Okay.
mass immigration.
Okay.
That's crazy.
I've heard your question. Let me answer it. Thanks. So I mean, again, people like Paul Ehrlich, who have been vilified, were actually bringing, you know, to our attention the problem of overpopulation decades ago. And you've alluded to something which is important here, that it isn't just the number of people, it's the sort of lifestyle that they're leading. In fact, there's an identity, we call it the Kaya identity, which is a way of estimating carbon emissions by looking at, you know, how many people are there, and how much energy are they using, and how are they getting that energy. And so you can express sort of our carbon output as a product of different terms, each of which we can try to get a handle on. How many people are there? What is the sort of you know, the carbon intensity, how carbon, you know, how reliant are they on carbon to get energy, and what sort of energy intensity, how much do they rely on energy to generate GDP. So it's a product of these terms. Now, Bill Gates actually discovered this equation a few years ago until it was pointed out to him that it had been discovered 2 decades ago. But on his blog, he was very excited about the fact that he had found this equation that could be used to estimate, well, he had rediscovered the Kaya identity, which is some decades old. But you put your finger again on something really important, which is it isn't just the number of people, it's what sort of lifestyle. A large number of people leading a fairly energy unintensive lifestyle won't generate as much carbon, and even if they're using an energy, and if they're living in an energy intensive lifestyle, if they're not getting their energy from fossil fuels but renewables, they still won't generate more carbon. So you can't just look at the number.
Land, biodiversity is also, you shoot those things, you do it away when you have large, huge numbers of people. The planet wasn't built for 10 billion people in 2100.
Well, you know, and that's, you put your finger on something else which is important, that we're just talking about one dimension of a multidimensional problem, which is environmental sustainability. Climate change is just one dimension of that problem. If we are to live sustainably on this planet, then we can't be overfishing and we can't be overexploiting the land. And it turns out, there's a nice literature, which I think you'd find relevant, and you might check out, which falls under the rubric of planetary boundaries. We're looking at the various limitations on, you know, the natural resources that we rely upon. So climate change is one of those, but food and water, and looking at, you know, how far are we out on the spectrum of overextending ourselves beyond the boundary of sustainability. By some estimates, now, again, I'm not an expert, but some experts have concluded that we are maybe a factor of 7 times larger than, in terms of the footprint, the environmental footprint that we have right now. We're about 7 times the carrying capacity of the planet. That's a problem. And so I think we're basically in agreement here, sir. Thanks for the question. Yeah. One more, sure. Yep.
As you pointed out, even if all the nations lived up to their voluntary commitments to the Paris Accord, it would still get us only partway to that 1.5 to 2 degrees. I'm wondering, is there a danger of that accord becoming sort of a fig leaf where nations can say, yes, we've pledged to do this, but with no teeth in it, they do nothing until it's too late?
Well, you know, that's where issues of accountability and enforcement come in, and one of the criticisms of the Paris Accord is that it's, you know, that it isn't enforceable through international law. It's the enforcement mechanism is a name and shame. It's a peer pressure. It's if you don't do your part, then you will be a pariah in the global community. And there's some evidence that that sort of works. I guess the real test will be over the next few years to really see on paper, to look at the numbers and see how well various participating nations are doing in meeting their obligations. As you may well know, there are issues with reporting, and one of the criticisms of China has been that their own reported carbon emissions numbers seem a little fishy. And so do we have verifiable data that we can actually use to determine who is and is not making good on their commitments? That's going to be important, and that is a potential weak point, is enforcement and validation, measurement, assessing actual progress. So that's what we'll see, and if things seem to be going well, then that means that we have something here we can build on, and we can ratchet up those commitments. If things aren't going well and countries aren't making good on their commitments, then we have a problem.
Hi. I'm wondering if you'll take one more.
Sure.
Student.
You'll be the last one. How's that?
And you'll forgive me for not making eye contact. I had to write down my thoughts. What systems or programs do you know of that are already in place to make information on climate change more accessible to those without prior knowledge or resources to being informed due to income inequality? Shout out to my social movements class. Because not only those with higher education or technological resources to be informed have a role to play in climate change or stakes in the matter if conditions do get worse. Additionally, if these don't exist, what is your take on how to involve those aforementioned in the conversation?
What was that last statement?
What is your take on how to involve those people aforementioned in the conversation?
Yeah, so this is an issue that information is not as readily available to certain communities as it is to others, and it's always difficult to assess the reliability of information and to be able to ensure that information is reliable. Part of it is, I think, choosing those who you view as trusted messengers. And if you like what I have to say, you can follow me on Twitter, and you'll get my angle on this, because I like to tweet links to articles that I think are important and to things that I think people should know about. And so social media is, to some extent, a democratizing tool. It has its problems, as we've seen now, writ large, and the way it may have been used in this latest election. But social media can be a very useful way of accessing information, and all you need is a smartphone or access to a...
Right, I think you're missing it. So I'm talking about those without access to computers, perhaps.
Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah.
Lack of social mobility, and so what do you do for that outreach-wise?
So that's more of a challenge, right? It requires more of an effort, for those, and frankly, if you're struggling to put food on the table, and for access to clean water, it's understandable that climate change may not be at the top of your sort of attention agenda. There is, in my view, a responsibility among those of us, those who are better off and have better access to those resources, to sort of take up the mantle of those who don't have that access, and to do more, because one of the injustices of climate change, and this is where climate justice, a very important part of the problem, is that the greatest harm, and this is true with environmental degradation in general. It's always been the case that those who feel the greatest impacts, who experience the greatest harm, are those who had the least to do with creating the problem in the first place. That's true generationally, but it's also true in a distributional sense with respect to income and to sort of the industrial world versus the developing world. And so one of the arguments is that, that those of us who created this problem, the Western nations that had access to 2 centuries of cheap, dirty energy have this additional obligation to take up some of that additional responsibility. So I think that's part of it, and to recognize that people who are struggling to put food and water, and drink, drinkable water on the table, have their, rightfully are focused on those activities, and something that we all appreciate, I think, in the wake of what's happened with Puerto Rico, and I would encourage people to help out. There are some verifiable charities that you can donate to that are helping those folks. I mean, the fact that we're witnessing this in America is appalling. It's not a third world country, it's our country, and we're allowing this to happen. Thank you.